G'day guys and welcome back to another video. In today's video we're going to talk about this here, custom Zastava LK M70 Stutzen. So long-term viewers of the channel are going to notice that this gun looks very familiar, and if it does look familiar, I'll jog your memory. So back a couple of years ago we did a Patreon inspired build where the patrons got to vote on what happened to this gun going from a bare receiver and building it all the way up. And they got to pick everything from the stock type, stock color, the finish on the gun, how we had it, whether we had a detachable magazine or a bottom metal, or everything about it they got to pick. Now that was a project that was done. You've seen that video. It popped up in the What's in My Safe video, where I showed it off there. Now, I wasn't too happy with how that gun turned out, being that it is my personal gun, not just because of the decisions that were made on how the gun was to be finished, because that in itself was a pretty cool little project. It's just, it wasn't really a gun that I wanted to have in my safe. Had I been building that for someone else and it was built to those specs, cool, whatever. That's what they wanted, that's what they got. But for me personally, I wanted to do something cool. I wanted to practice some woodwork, and that's why we've come up with this project here. The stock is actually beechwood, it's not walnut, contrary to how it looks, and that's from a Parker Hale 1200 series. So they were made with a fairly cheap beechwood stock. I did buy that stock for fairly cheap. I think it was like $150 or $200 or something at the time. Now during the Patreon build we painted that green because it was a beechwood stock. They decided that they didn't really want to have the blonde colour of beechwood, so they opted to have me paint it. So in the process of rebuilding this gun, I stripped all that paint off, sanded it all the way back to bare wood, and then I went about refinishing it. Now, you can notice that it is not a short stock anymore. It is a full-length Stutzen, and we'll talk about the front end in a little bit, but let's talk about what I did to this part of the stock here. So after it was stripped back, it was stained with I tried a few different types of stains to really get that walnut color. Now, because it is beechwood, not every stain is going to work the same as if they would on other woods. So I actually tried a walnut stain to start with, and that went way too dark. So I ended up mixing a few different stains together and ended up with the color that we have here. That stain, so the wood itself was stained as it was being sanded. I also mixed the stain with linseed oil and sanded in the finish. So a traditional sanded in finish is where you wet the wood down with oil and then you sand it, and the dust from the wood mixes with linseed oil. It creates almost like a paste which fills up the wood grain, and that's how you get that super smooth finish on a wood stock. It's not the most economical way of doing a finish because it does take a very long time, but it is the traditional way of doing a finish. Other methods you can use is you can spray a clear coat on it and then sand that clear coat off, and what's left is the clear coat or varnish, whatever you use, is going to sit down in the pores of the wood and fill it up, and that's another quicker method of doing it, but I opted to go with the traditional. So at the same time as all this is happening, I actually reshaped the forend. So I'll just bring the forend into frame, so while I talk about it, you can visualize what we're talking about here. The stock, traditionally a normal short stock, would come to about there. I wanted a Stutzen. Now, you may also know this is a Mannlicher stock. Both are technically correct names for it. Most people will refer to it as a Mannlicher stock because Mannlicher made a lot of rifles with this style of stock. But to my knowledge, the Germans would call this a Stutzen, being the style of stock that's a full length. So there's a few different names you can run this by. Full stock is one, Stutzen is one, and Mannlicher is one. I'm just going to call it a Stutzen, but feel free to insert any of those names as you see fit while I'm talking about it. I didn't want to try and match it to the beechwood because I knew I wasn't going to be able to find a piece of beechwood that big. So I knew it was going to be a slightly different color when I finished. So I went into this knowing that. Now, what I actually ended up doing is I just popped down to my local Bunnings and I bought a Tasmanian oak handrail for, I think it was $20 for 1 meter long length, and I lopped off, a foot of it, however long that is, and then I went about shaping it. Now, I'm not a very good woodworker. It's something that I'm trying to upskill myself on. I'm not a stock maker and I'm not a woodworker, but I feel like I pulled this one off quite well. So to attach it to the original stock, this piece in here, this angled piece, which lines up with our stippling, is actually Madagascar ebony. So this was an offcut from some ebony 4-end tips that I've done on previous builds. One of those builds you've probably seen on the channel, which was the 458 Win Mag M77 Safari that I built. So I had an offcut and I decided to laminate that in. Now, the reason I did that is it makes the join look a little bit better. If you run, you know, we've got the darker wood of the rest of the stock, and then we have the lighter wood of the Tasmanian oak. If you run those together, which you can definitely do, it would just, in my opinion, look a bit funny. So by running that ebony spacer in there, it gives it a distinct start and finish, and I think it ties it together much better. So those 3 bits are pinned with dowels and adhered to one another with glues. After that was done, the top of the fore-end was then inletted for the barrel. The barrel and everything was then glass bed to the channel. So it is full length bedded all the way down to the muzzle. And that's done for stability. Now, this is where you're going to run into people saying, oh, you should have free floated it, because everyone really raves on about free floated barrels. Not every gun needs to be free floated barrel, particularly if it's a thin sporter. Thin sporters do actually, you know, gain something from being supported. So once that was epoxy bedded, then I went about shaping the fore-end there. Now on the end we have a schnabel. Now schnabel is translates roughly to beak, so it's a beak end on it, looks like a bird's beak. If you look at it, it's quite a bit, you know, looks like I've modeled it off my phallus, and that's just the style that is. There's a few different, within schnabels, there's a few different styles and shapes. This is the one that I thought looked the best, and that's the one that I ended up carving. So there was a lot of work with rasps, files, sandpaper, etc. to get that down to shape, and it blends in quite well with the rest of the stock now. Another thing I added, which is done traditionally a lot on these style of rifles in Europe, is to support the fore-end, because if you only have your dowels across here holding the fore-end on, you know, after a lot of firing, after time, it can work its way off, and then you've got to do a stock repair. So to get around that, traditionally what happens is we have a screw somewhere on the gun. So typically what they're going to do is just put a boss somewhere on the bottom of the barrel. There'll be a hole in the bottom of the stock, and there'll just be a screw that goes through into the internal threads on that boss. So that way it's mechanically held to the gun itself. So the boss for this is actually where the sling swivel stud is. So I found a sling swivel stud in my box of goodies that had a machine thread on it, and that was to go into a brass escutcheon on whatever rifle that came off. I ended up using that and drilling and tapping the hole in the bottom of the boss to make that thread. So unscrewing that sling stud actually releases the barrel from the barrel channel. So that's just an easy way of hiding it. That way you don't have to have, you know, a sling stud and then also another hole that would kind of look ugly. So when you look at the bottom of the gun here, there is no extra holes anywhere. There's literally just that sling stud. And had I not told you that, you probably wouldn't know that that was there. So moving on with the rest of the stock as well. So if we move this back to see this checkering panel, I kept the original lines of the back of the checkering pattern. I extended it up to meet the very top, so it's borderless at the top. All the borders are hand cut with a checkering file, and I matched the angle to the angle of our spacer just to give it a very uniform look. I have seen on other rifles where they don't do the same angle across the spacer. Let's say for instance they put an ebony 4-end tip on a rifle and it already had checkering, and they wanted to do an angled cut. When it doesn't meet the same angle as the checkering pattern, or somewhat complements it, in my opinion, it looks half done. So in this one, I made it a point to make it the same angle just to give it that little bit extra pizzazz. Now, hand checkering a rifle is extremely hard, and hand checkering in beech is even harder because the fibers tend to stand up a lot. It's just not the best wood. Walnut is obviously excellent to checker, and a lot of those hardwoods are. If you've ever worked with beechwood and tried to sand it or cut it, you'll know that it splinters very easily. It's very fuzzy. It doesn't hold an edge very well when it comes to very small things. So checkering in this wasn't really an option. I am by no means a very good checkering dude anyway. I can touch up a line here and there with my checkering files, but doing a whole pattern is a little bit beyond my skill set. And that's what stockers are for. You know, had this been a walnut stock, I may have gone down that route, but also I wanted this to have, it's an old school style rifle, but I wanted to have some modern flair to it. And I really do like the look of stippling on a modern style wooden stocked rifle. So I ended up doing all that stippling with a little hand rotary tool. You know, it wasn't Dremel branded, but just imagine a Dremel, essentially that with a little ball nose carbide tip. Yeah, I just went to work and stippled the shit out of it, essentially. Each panel took me roughly, I don't know, 20 minutes to half an hour to do. When you compare that to hand checkering, if you're an experienced stock maker, each panel might take you, I don't know, 5 hours to do hand checkering. I'm sure there are people out there who are much, much quicker than that. Typically to checker a whole stock is a couple of days work. So it's quicker than hand checkering. It's better to do when the wood is not conducive to checkering, and it gives it that modern look. So I did that down on the grip as well. And yeah, I think it looks quite nice. Now, when we look at the buttstock here, this used to have a Monte Carlo on it. Now, Monte Carlos became very popular in the 1970s. Now, if you have iron sights, Monte Carlos aren't the best because it will put your face just a little bit too high to see down the iron sights. So in keeping with our theme of being a German style or European style rifle, I gave it a hogback. Now, you'll hear this referred to as a hogback, pigback, where we are actually curved on the top. Now, it gives you the benefit of, it's still slightly higher than a straight stock, so you can use a scope and irons. But the actual biggest benefit of a hogback is it's very, very quick to shoulder the rifle and get down the iron sights. And that's the whole reason why a lot of the rifles set up for driven hunting are set up in that way. I've used kick ease recoil pads on a lot of builds, but one thing I'm finding is the kick ease pads aren't really lasting the best when it comes in contact with the stock oils. So on my next couple of builds, what I'm going to do is use Pacmire decelerators. They're still a grinder fit pad, and from what I have been told, they will last a little bit longer. The kick ease pads are great. They're super soft and they absorb a lot of recoil. That one's only thin. That's just a little, you know, half-inch pad or whatever. They do go up to like an inch or an inch and a quarter, something like that for the Magnums. And on my big kickers, they do work really well. I've got one on my 458 Win Mag, and that works exceptionally well. I just find that they're not lasting that well. And also standing them up in the safe when you're resting on the pad itself, seems to be deteriorating them or squishing them down, and they're not really bouncing back. So that's all stock work done. So let's have a chat about what else I did here. So the trigger is a Recknagel side safety trigger. Now, obviously a Zastava M70, if you didn't know, is set up for side safety, which is why you don't have any safety stuff up on the bolt shroud. So I did need to find something with side safety for this gun. I ended up finding one of these. The barrel in action has been Cerakoted in Midnight Blue, which is like a, it's a Cerakote, but it looks like bluing. And I'm sure you would have got this far in the video and not realized that that's not a blued gun. Cerakote is fantastic stuff. Now, the big elephant in the room that you may notice, and I'm sure you've been staring at the whole video, is the magazine on the bottom, because a Mauser 98 commercial does not normally have that. That is a Sauer magazine, and that bottom metal is a Sauer magazine conversion. Now, that kit is done by Vore. I'm sure I butchered the pronunciation on that. If we pop this off, it has a side release here. And we can pull this out. It's a 5-round magazine. This one's set up for 30-06, 270 Win, 6x62, 6.5x55, 6.5x57, 7x57, 7x64, and 2506. Different feed lips. You can't fit 9.3x62 in this, even though you can fit 7x64, because the feed lips at the front don't allow for the wider bullet. Just a point of note, because I tried to do that and it didn't work. But anyway, that's the magazine, and I think it looks quite cool on this rifle because it's something different. If the rifle looked like that, you would just be like, oh yeah, it's just any other Sporter Mauser. But with this on here, clicks in. That's obviously some stock work I had to do, was inletting to allow for that, side magazine release. Bottom metal is all, you know, pretty standard looking Mauser. I do like the way they've shaped the trigger guard where it's quite belled out of the front here, and that's to allow you to shoot with gloves on in the cold. Just a very good product from Voro. On top of that action there, we have EAW swing-off mounts. Now, I've featured swing-off mounts or pivot mounts on my channel a number of times, but for those of you who are uninitiated, you push this button and you rotate it, scope comes off, and then you can run your iron sights, and then you can literally just click it back on and you've returned to zero. So it's a fantastic system. I don't know why they're not more popular in Australia. They're popular in Europe, they're popular in Africa for dangerous game rifles. I've got them on a few of my rifles because I do like to run iron sights a lot of the time. It's just my personal preference. I'm a bit of a weirdo like that, but I also like to be able to scope the rifles too. So why not have a pivot mount and you can put them on and off. Now you can get the same sort of thing out of quick detach Picatinny rail mounts, but Picatinny rail generally doesn't return to zero as well as this style or claw mount quick detaches, just inherently in the way they're designed. But if you do want to go down that path and you want to do it cheaper than buying those, because those are very expensive, you can go down the path of using quick detach Picatinny rail mounts. So let's look at the iron sights now. As you can see, this one doesn't have a rear sight. I'm going to zoom in a bit. So as you can see, this one doesn't have a rear sight insert, but the base is there. Now, the front and rear sight bases on this rifle I machined myself, dovetailed it to fit the rear sight insert. The insert that's going on this rifle I haven't fitted yet because I need to take it to the range and I need to actually shoot it in. So that's the process of filing the notch and shooting it until you've actually sighted in the rifle that way, because there's no adjustment in these sights. Once they're zeroed, they're zeroed for whatever load you're zeroing for. Now, out of this rifle, I'm going to run 180 grain pills. I want it to be a pretty hard hitter. I'm not going to be shooting very far with this rifle. So I'll probably be shooting 180s. It's the benefit of use. It's still fairly flat shooting, but it hits very hard. Sometimes if you step up to like the 200s or the 210s, they tend to drop very fast. I may go down that path, I may not. Another thing you can do with this setup is you can set the iron sights for one load and then you can set the scope up for another load. So let's say you wanted to have, let's say I did want to fire 150s, I could have that zeroed for my scope. So if I'm shooting longer, I put the scope on, I use the 150s. And if I want to go stalking up really close and use the irons, I can rip the scope off and load up some 200 grainers, for instance, and go on a nice close-in stalk with a heavy hitter. So that's the benefit of having the two different sighting systems. So once I finish that sight, it'll go on. I haven't done it, but I still wanted to show you the rifle, so that's why there is no rear sight on there. But let's just have a look at that rear sight island. So, nicely machined. These curves on the front and rear were done with a really, really big radius cutter, where this is held in the mill, essentially on the orientation you're looking at, and this cutter comes down and saddles over everything and cuts it into there. I can't really show you any of that because YouTube keeps on striking me for showing you machine work on guns. So that's our rear sight, and as we move down to our front sight, this is where the cool thing happens. So that's not a very fancy front sight at first look. You know, we've got a radius cut in the back here, we've got it scalloped out on the sides, and a radius cut on the front. Now what is cool though is, before I radius cut this part, I actually hand checkered the steel. Now after cutting, this point right here, you can just see with my thumbnail, now you can just see a little bit of checkering left at the top there. Now that's there to provide anti-glare. A lot of custom rifles from back in the ye oldies are going to have that in there. And it's just a wee little thing that if you didn't know was there, you wouldn't know about it, but I know it's there and I think that's pretty cool. Normally you would have a dovetail machined in from the front, and this fibre optic or white bead or whatever you want to use would be an insert. Now on this one, I really wanted to do something different. This is actually integrally machined into the base. So there is no dovetail insert. If there was, you would see one in the front there. There's not. So all of those really, really tiny cuts I did on my mill. Yeah, I milled all that down. I drilled a hole through it for the insert, and then I milled out these slots. A little bit of hand cleanup, and I think it turned out quite nice. So that's another one of those little things. If you didn't know that, if you didn't look close enough, you wouldn't realize that, and you wouldn't realize how much work and effort actually goes into doing something custom like that. And while we're up the front here, nice and close, you can see the very phallic end of my schnabel. So there you have it, guys. That is just a brief overview on my Zastava LK M70 3006 Stutzen stalking rifle. I hope that was interesting enough. I hope it wasn't blabbing on too much. I hope you appreciate the amount of work that's gone into that. As I said, I'm not a stocker, so some of the stock work is not the best in the world, but it is something I'm trying to upskill myself on, so I don't have to outsource work to other people. I can just, do it myself. Pretty cool little rifle. I can't wait to take it out and one sight in that rear sight, but also take some game with it. I would love to shoot a red deer or a fallow with that. I think it would be an excellent gun for that thing. So yeah, I hope you got something out of that. I hope you enjoyed. If you've got any questions or comments, leave them in the comments. Try to be nice, because I seem to be getting a lot of shit in my comments of late. And to YouTube, no, I didn't show any work of this getting built, so please don't strike my channel again. I'm just trying to make a living. Anyway, I'll catch you next video, and hooroo.